The western frontier breathed with a raw, untamed rhythm. A symphony of whispering winds, creaking pines, and the slow heartbeat of the wide river that curved like a silver snake through the valley. Evening was falling, casting a golden hue over the plains before bleeding into a deep violet. The horizon stretched endlessly, as if the land itself had no boundaries, only an eternal silence that carried both beauty and danger. At the river's edge, Clementine Shaw bent down to gather firewood. She was 8 years old, a fragile little thing with hair the color of sun-bleached wheat and eyes that carried a storm of sorrow beyond her years. Her small, cracked hands trembled slightly as she bundled the dry twigs. The wind, cold and relentless, tangled her hair, whipping it across her face like a reminder of how exposed she was in this wild, unforgiving land. Once she had known warmth. Her grandmother's cabin had been filled with the smell of cornbread and wildflowers. But 3 months ago, that warmth had been stolen when her grandmother, her only family, passed away quietly during the night. Since then, Clementine had learned to fend for herself, to light the hearth with kindling, to catch fish from the river, and to mend her threadbare dress with clumsy stitches. The cabin had become both her shield and her prison. The river had always been her silent companion. Sometimes it soothed her, its soft gurgle like a lullaby. Other times, especially at dusk, it looked like a wild animal, its black waters swirling with secrets. Tonight, as twilight deepened and the mist rolled in low, Clementine felt the loneliness settle heavy on her shoulders. She glanced at the sky, now a painted canvas of indigo streaked with fire. "Grandma," she whispered softly to no one. "It's just me now." Then she heard it. A cry. The sound tore through the stillness, sharp and desperate. Clementine froze, her breath catching. The cry came again, carried on the cold wind, echoing across the water. It was the sound of someone fighting not just fear but death itself. She dropped the bundle of wood, her gaze scanning the river. And then she saw her, a girl, about her age, struggling against the raging current. Her long black hair was plastered against her face, and her skin was pale with exhaustion. She was trying to keep her head above the water, but her right leg was twisted, useless against the pull of the river. Every time she tried to stand, the current yanked her back under. Clementine's heart pounded. She remembered the warnings from her grandmother. "Stay away from the native tribes. We don't share the same world, child. Sometimes a line can't be crossed." But what she saw in those frantic, dark eyes wasn't an enemy. It was fear, pure, desperate fear. And Clementine couldn't look away. She kicked off her shoes, pulled her skirt higher, and without another thought, plunged into the river. The cold hit her like a slap, stealing her breath and making her bones ache. The current was stronger than she imagined, pushing her back with every step. She gritted her teeth, feeling sharp stones bite into her feet. Twice she slipped, falling under the icy water, the weight of her wet dress dragging her down. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Every beat of her heart told her the same thing. If you turn back, she will die. When she reached the girl, Clementine's lungs were burning, her arms trembling from the effort. The girl's lips were blue, her breaths ragged. She muttered something in her language, words Clementine couldn't understand, but her eyes, those wide, pleading eyes, spoke volumes. Clementine wrapped one arm around the girl's waist, fighting the current with every step. The mud clung to their feet like claws. Clementine slipped again, scraping her knees, but she tightened her grip. Inch by inch, she dragged them both back to the bank. They collapsed onto the shore, gasping. For a moment, neither moved, the sound of their breaths mingling with the river's roar. Clementine pressed her palm to her chest. "Clementine," she whispered, barely audible. The girl turned her head, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks, and after a pause, she murmured, "Ayana." That single word felt like a fragile promise, a name shared between two worlds. It took all of Clementine's strength to help Ayana to her feet. The girl could barely stand, her legs swollen and throbbing. Clementine half carried, half dragged her along the narrow path to the cabin. The wooden door creaked as they stumbled inside, the smell of old smoke and pine filling the air. Clementine guided Ayana to the corner near the hearth. The fire had gone cold, so she knelt, her fingers stiff as she arranged the twigs she'd dropped earlier. A spark caught, and soon the firelight flickered across Ayana's face, revealing just how bad her injuries were. Scratches covered her arms, and blood had dried on her knee. Clementine chewed her lip, searching her mind for what her grandmother used to do. She found an old shirt and tore it into strips. With trembling hands, she used a piece of broken wood as a splint, binding Ayana's leg as gently as possible. Ayana winced, tears rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't cry out. Clementine spoke softly, murmuring stories as she worked. Stories of the first snow, of a deer that used to visit the clearing by the river. She wasn't sure if Ayana understood, but she felt the girls breathing slow, the panic fading into something like trust. From a tin plate, Clementine brought out the last of her cornbread and a handful of dried berries. She split them in half, offering Ayana the larger piece. They ate in silence, their eyes meeting occasionally over the fire. For the first time in months, Clementine didn't feel like the only child left in the world. As the night deepened, the wind howled outside, rattling the cabin walls. But inside, the glow of the fire wrapped around them like a fragile shield. Clementine looked at Ayana, who had fallen asleep with her head resting against the wall. She whispered softly, "You're safe now. I'll keep you safe." The dawn came creeping over the horizon, quiet but heavy with tension. The first light stretched across the sky like soft brushstrokes of pale gold, painting the tops of the trees and the still surface of the river. But it wasn't the light that woke Clementine. It was the sound. At first, it was faint, like a drum beating far away, a rhythm hidden beneath the whispers of morning wind. Then it grew louder, closer. Hoofbeats, many of them. The earth seemed to tremble as though a storm was rolling in, not of rain but of men and horses. Clementine's eyes shot open. She sat up, heart pounding in her chest. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, filling the cabin with a dull, smoky smell. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Then she saw Ayana. The girl was sitting upright, her dark eyes wide and alert, as if she already knew what was coming. "Do you hear that?" Clementine whispered, her voice shaking. Ayana didn't answer. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the narrow cracks in the wooden wall. The sound grew louder, pounding in a rhythm that shook the small cabin. Hooves on frozen ground. Clementine crawled to the window, peeking through a gap in the planks. Her breath caught in her throat. They were here. A ring of riders surrounded the cabin, 30 warriors, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning light. They sat tall and silent on their horses, which snorted clouds of mist into the cold air. The warriors were dressed in deerskin, their hair adorned with feathers that trembled in the breeze. Their faces, painted with streaks of black and crimson, reflected both strength and sorrow, as though each mark told a story of battles and loss. The tips of their spears glinted like shards of fire in the dawn. For a moment, Clementine couldn't breathe. All the stories she'd heard in town rushed back to her. Stories of raids, of villages burned, of children who disappeared without a trace. Fear coiled in her stomach like a snake. Beside her, Ayana let out a cry, a word, strong and clear, in her native tongue. Clementine glanced at her, startled. But the expression on Ayana's face wasn't fear. It was joy, relief. "Your family?" Clementine asked, though she knew the answer before Ayana nodded. From outside, voices answered Ayana's call. The words were harsh and quick, filled with urgency and suspicion. Clementine couldn't understand what they were saying, but their tone was sharp, like arrows cutting through the air. The sound of boots hitting the ground pulled Clementine's gaze back to the riders. One of them had dismounted. He was taller than the others, with a presence that seemed to bend the world around him. His shoulders were broad, his movements deliberate, as though each step carried the weight of authority. His face was marked with black and red paint, not as a mask of war but as symbols of leadership, of a man who carried both his people's past and their future. Ayana's lips trembled. She whispered something that sounded like, "Papa." The man, running bare, stopped a few paces from the door. His dark eyes scanned the cabin, narrowing as if trying to see through the walls. The air between them seemed to hum with tension. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, commanding thuds. Not violent but heavy with meaning. Clementine froze. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "When you're afraid, child, stand tall. Fear has no power over a straight spine." She swallowed hard. Her small hand trembled as she reached for the latch. Ayana, sensing her hesitation, touched her arm gently. The girl's dark eyes seemed to say, "It's all right." Clementine drew in a deep breath, then opened the door. The morning light flooded in, blinding her for a moment. When her eyes adjusted, she saw him standing there, running bare. His presence was overwhelming, like standing in the shadow of a mountain. But his eyes, they weren't cruel. They were searching, scanning the small figure of Clementine and the injured Ayana behind her. Ayana let out a sob of relief and hobbled forward. The man's face changed instantly, softening like snow under the sun. He caught her in his arms, holding her as though he would never let go again. Clementine stepped back, feeling like she had intruded on something sacred. After a long moment, Running Bear looked at Clementine. He stepped toward her, his gaze intense but not hostile. Ayana began speaking rapidly, gesturing toward her bandaged leg and pointing at Clementine, repeating her name, "Clementine, Clementine." The chief listened, his dark eyes flicking between the 2 girls. Then, in halting English, he said, "You save my heart." He placed a hand over his chest, then pointed to Ayana. "My daughter, my heart, you save." Clementine blinked, stunned. She hadn't expected this giant of a man to speak to her with such gentleness. From a leather pouch at his side, Running Bear took out something. A small, round medallion carved from polished stone. Intricate symbols spiraled across its surface, catching the morning light. He held it out to her with both hands, as though offering something sacred. "This family," he said, slowly, his voice low and steady. "Now you sister, Ayana's sister, my child." Clementine's hands shook as he placed the medallion around her neck. It was heavier than it looked, and the cool stone warmed almost immediately against her skin. Behind him, the other warriors were watching. Their faces, once sharp with suspicion, now softened. Some murmured to each other, their eyes flicking to Clementine with something like respect. Clementine glanced down at the medallion. Her grandmother's pendant still hung there too, a simple piece of carved wood worn smooth by time. For a strange, quiet moment, she felt as though both worlds, her past and Ayana's, were meeting in the space between her heartbeats. Running Bear stepped back, but his gaze stayed fixed on her, measuring, as if trying to see what kind of spirit lived inside this small, pale-haired child. Ayana reached for Clementine's hand and squeezed it. Her eyes sparkled, even with tears still clinging to her lashes. In that moment, Clementine realized something. She wasn't just an outsider anymore. She had been seen. She had been claimed, not by blood, but by something deeper, a shared act of courage. The cabin that once felt like a shield now seemed like a fragile shell, ready to splinter under the weight of the world pressing in. Clementine stood near the doorway, her fingers nervously brushing the carved medallion Running Bear had given her. Felt heavy, not just the weight of stone, but of meaning. Outside, the 30 warriors waited, their horses shifting restlessly. The early light glimmered on the tips of their spears and arrowheads, casting sharp, fleeting flashes as they moved. Clementine felt as though the whole world had narrowed to this moment, between the warmth of the cabin she knew and the unknown that stood outside. Running Bear's deep voice cut through the tension like the steady toll of a drum. He was speaking to one of his scouts, who had returned from the ridge, his face shadowed with concern. Clementine couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. Something was coming. Something dangerous. The chief turned his gaze to her, and even before he spoke, Clementine felt her heart clench. "Soldiers, coming," he said slowly, choosing each word like a heavy stone placed on the ground. They find Ayana. They find you. Clementine's throat went dry. She had heard stories about the border soldiers, the way they treated anyone who stood between them and their orders. To them, a girl like her, white but living among natives, would be branded as a traitor. They wouldn't care that she was just a child. "What will they do if they find me here?" Clementine asked, her voice trembling. Running Bear didn't answer with words. His expression, hard, grim, told her everything she needed to know. Ayana reached for Clementine's hand, her small fingers warm despite the morning chill. "Come," she said softly, her accent rolling over the simple word like a melody. "Sister, family, safe, family." The word struck something deep inside Clementine. She hadn't heard that word spoken to her in so long. Not with sincerity, not with love. Her grandmother was gone. Her parents had died when she was too young to remember their faces. For months, she had been adrift, like a single leaf on the current of the river. But Ayana's eyes, dark, trusting, offered something she hadn't dared hope for: belonging. Running Bear crouched down so his eyes met Clementine's. "Alone, winter come. You die." His English was broken but steady. "With us, fire, food, family. You live, you learn. We protect." Behind him, the warriors began to move with quiet efficiency. They weren't like the soldiers Clementine had seen from a distance, shouting and clanging with noise. These men were silent, their movements precise. They gathered Clementine's few belongings: a tattered quilt her grandmother had sewn, a wooden spoon, a small book with frayed pages. They handled everything with surprising care, as if they understood that these objects carried a piece of the old woman's spirit. The sound of distant hoofbeats rolled through the air like thunder. Soldiers. They were still far but closing fast. Clementine's chest tightened. She turned to the cabin, her eyes roaming over the things she'd known all her life. The crooked table where her grandmother used to read to her, the hearth that once smelled of soup and pine wood, the window where she had watched so many sunsets. "Will I ever see this place again?" she whispered to herself. Ayana touched her arm, gently pulling her out of her thoughts. "Come," she said again, her voice soft but insistent. "We go. Now." Running Bear's eyes locked with Clementine's. "Time gone," he said firmly. "Now or never." Clementine's heart pounded. She felt torn between two worlds. One familiar but lonely, the other unknown but full of something she couldn't name. Her hand clenched around her grandmother's wooden pendant. She could almost hear her voice. "Child, home isn't where the walls are. Home is where your heart feels safe." She took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The warriors moved quickly. They packed her belongings onto a spare horse, one with a soft brown coat and gentle eyes. Running Bear lifted Clementine onto the saddle with surprising tenderness, as if she were his own daughter. Ayana climbed up behind her, wrapping her arms around Clementine's waist. "Hold your sister," Running Bear said, his voice deep and warm. "On horse, you protect her. In heart, she protect you." The rest of the warriors mounted their horses. There was no shouting, no chaos, just quiet discipline. Each man knew his place, his role, like the pieces of a living machine. Clementine glanced back at the cabin one last time. The early sunlight kissed the roof, turning it into a patch of gold against the gray hills. For a moment, she thought she saw her grandmother standing in the doorway, smiling faintly. "Go, child," the image seemed to whisper. "Go where you're needed." Then they were moving. The horses surged forward, hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that matched Clementine's racing heartbeat. The wind tore at her hair, the cold air stinging her cheeks. She held onto the reins tightly, feeling Ayana's small arms squeezing her from behind. From behind them came another sound, the sharp, metallic clatter of soldiers on horseback. Clementine's stomach knotted. Running Bear gave a signal, and the warriors veered off the main path, cutting across the wild terrain. They moved like shadows, weaving through trees and over ridges with practiced ease. Clementine had never ridden a horse before, but with Ayana holding her tightly, she found a strange kind of courage. Each leap over a fallen log, each turn along the rocky trail, made her feel like she was part of something bigger, a moving force of survival and determination. "Are they close?" Clementine whispered, but Ayana didn't answer. She didn't need to. The urgency in the way the warriors moved told her everything. After what felt like hours but could have been minutes, they paused at the top of a hill. Clementine turned to look back. From here, the valley stretched wide and silent, her cabin nothing but a dark speck among the trees. It struck her suddenly, with a pang both sharp and sweet. She wasn't just leaving the cabin. She was leaving the girl she used to be, the lonely child who only knew how to survive. Ayana leaned close, her voice soft against Clementine's ear. "Sister," she said, smiling faintly. "We go home. Home." Clementine repeated the word silently, tasting its meaning. For the first time in a long while, it didn't feel like a place made of wood and nails. It felt like this wind in her hair, a sister's arms around her, and a new life waiting beyond the hills. The journey stretched into the late morning, the sun climbing higher but the air still cool and sharp. Clementine felt every beat of the horse beneath her, every gust of wind that whipped against her face. The rhythm of 30 hooves was like a drumline, steady and unyielding, echoing through the hills. It was both frightening and mesmerizing. Running Bear led the group at a steady pace, his silhouette outlined against the sky like a moving monument. He didn't shout or bark commands. Instead, his hand gestures, subtle nods, and the weight of his presence were enough to guide the warriors. It was as if they shared a language beyond words, a rhythm of trust and precision. Clementine, perched in front of Ayana, tried to take everything in. The landscape seemed endless. Rolling hills that stretched like waves, dry grass bending in the breeze, and the distant cry of an eagle circling high above. The farther they rode, the more she realized how vast and alive this land was. It wasn't the empty, dangerous place she'd been told it was. It was a world full of its own music, its own heartbeat. Ayana leaned forward and pointed to a cluster of distant peaks. "Home," she said softly. Her voice carried both pride and longing, like a child who had been away for too long. They traveled down a narrow path through a stand of tall pines. The sunlight filtered through the branches, painting patterns of gold on the ground. Clementine could hear the creak of leather saddles, the soft jingle of horse tack, and occasionally, a low murmur of voices between the warriors. She glanced at Ayana, who seemed calmer now. The native girl's grip on Clementine's waist had loosened slightly, her dark eyes scanning the landscape with familiarity. It struck Clementine that this girl, despite her injury, was far braver than anyone she had met before. A flock of birds burst from the trees, scattering like black sparks against the sky. One of the warriors looked back and gave a brief signal, something Clementine didn't understand but which seemed to mean all clear. The path dipped, and suddenly, the trees thinned out. Clementine's breath caught as the land opened up before her. Below them lay a valley so breathtaking that Clementine almost forgot to breathe. The river wound like a silver ribbon through a field of green, sparkling under the noon sun. Clusters of teepees stood in a wide circle, smoke rising lazily from their tops. Children darted between them, their laughter carrying faintly through the air. Horses grazed on the meadow, their coats gleaming like polished chestnut and coal. Felt like stepping into another world, a world that pulsed with life, yet somehow felt older, wiser than anything Clementine had ever known. Ayana's face lit up. She pointed to the valley, her voice trembling with joy. "Home," she said again, louder this time. But for Clementine, the word home was still strange on her tongue. Her heart ached as she thought of her grandmother's cabin. Lonely but familiar. This new place felt like a storybook brought to life, but it wasn't her story. Not yet. As the group descended into the valley, the atmosphere changed. People began to notice. Women paused their weaving, children stopped mid-game, and the men standing near the fire straightened, their eyes narrowing with curiosity. Clementine felt their stares like arrows. Some faces were open, but others were guarded, even cold. She was, after all, a stranger, a pale-haired child who didn't belong to their world. Her instinct was to shrink into herself, to hide behind Ayana. But Ayana squeezed her hand. The injured girl sat straighter in the saddle, her dark eyes shining with defiance. "Sister," she said firmly, as if daring anyone to argue. Running Bear raised a hand, and the crowd fell silent as they approached the largest teepee in the center of the camp. Its walls were painted with symbols: soaring eagles, running deer, the sun and moon chasing each other in an endless circle. It was the kind of place that seemed to hum with the weight of history. The horses were tied near the fires, and Running Bear helped both girls down. Clementine's legs wobbled from the long ride, and she nearly stumbled, but Ayana's hand steadied her. The chief gave a few orders in his native tongue, and soon the entire camp gathered. Men, women, and children formed a wide circle around the two girls. Clementine felt her stomach twist. It felt like standing on trial, though she had no idea what she was accused of. Running Bear stepped into the center, his broad frame casting a long shadow on the earth. He spoke in a strong, resonant voice. Clementine didn't understand the words, but she understood the emotion. He was telling their story, the story of a little girl who risked her life to save his daughter. Ayana stepped forward, limping slightly but refusing to let the pain slow her. She pointed to her bandaged leg, then to Clementine, miming the rescue with small, dramatic gestures. Her voice, though soft, carried across the circle. Clementine's cheeks flushed. She wasn't used to being noticed, let alone praised. An elderly woman, her hair as white as the mountain snow, stepped forward from the circle. She wore a necklace made of carved bones and feathers, and her eyes, sharp but kind, locked on Clementine. She reached out, touching the medallion Running Bear had given her. In a voice like the whisper of wind through leaves, she spoke. Clementine didn't understand the words, but when Running Bear translated, her heart clenched. She says, "The spirits have brought this child here. She is not enemy. She is bridge. A heart that saves another heart belongs to the Great Spirit." Clementine felt something warm spread through her chest. She wasn't sure if it was pride or relief, or both. The crowd murmured, the tension easing. Children inched closer, curiosity overcoming fear. One boy, no older than 6, touched Clementine's golden hair, giggling as if it were spun from sunlight. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Clementine found herself wrapped in a soft blanket made of deerskin. The women of the tribe offered her a bowl of warm stew, rich with herbs and flavors she couldn't name. It was the first real meal she had tasted in weeks, and tears pricked her eyes as she swallowed the first bite. For the first time since her grandmother's death, Clementine felt something like belonging. Not completely, not yet, but the walls around her heart, walls built from loneliness and fear, were starting to crumble. Ayana sat beside her, leaning against her shoulder. "Sister," she said again, smiling faintly, and for the first time, Clementine smiled back without hesitation. The sun dipped behind the mountains, bleeding gold and crimson across the horizon. The entire valley was bathed in a warm, molten glow, as though the land itself was preparing for the arrival of the night. Smoke curled gently from the fires near the teepees, carrying the scent of herbs and roasted meat. Clementine sat near Ayana, her hands wrapped around a wooden bowl of stew that was richer and heartier than anything she had tasted in months. She felt the heat of the fire against her face and the softness of the deerskin blanket draped around her shoulders. For the first time since her grandmother's passing, Clementine wasn't just surviving. She was living. Her stomach was full, her hands were warm, and for a brief, fragile moment, her heart didn't ache. As the sky deepened to indigo, Running Bear stood in the center of the camp. He raised one hand, and silence fell as though the entire valley had been holding its breath. The tribe gathered around the main fire, forming a circle. Sparks leapt into the air like fireflies, floating toward the stars. Running Bear's voice rolled over them like distant thunder. Deep, commanding, but not harsh. Clementine didn't understand his words, but she felt their weight. He was speaking of courage, of kindness, of the small blonde-haired girl who had saved his daughter from the river's grasp. Ayana sat beside Clementine, her fingers intertwined with hers, nodding with every sentence as if to say, "Yes, this is your story too." Then the drumming began. A slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the earth. The warriors tapped the drums with sticks wrapped in leather, the sound resonating through the ground, through Clementine's bones. Women began to sing, their voices rising and falling like the wind across the plains. It wasn't just music. It was something older, deeper, a call to the soul. Clementine sat still, wide-eyed, as the tribe moved in time with the beat. The warriors' feet stamped the ground in a pattern that echoed the rhythm of the drums. Shadows danced against the teepees, flickering in a way that made the entire camp feel alive. Ayana smiled and tugged at Clementine's hand, pulling her gently toward the circle. Clementine hesitated. No one had ever asked her to dance before. Her grandmother used to hum lullabies, but this was something primal and powerful. Ayana squeezed her hand again. "Sister," she said softly, "dance." Clementine stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the cool earth. The drumbeat guided her. She moved clumsily at first, her small body swaying awkwardly. But then she felt something shift. She wasn't just moving to the music. She was part of it, part of this living, breathing circle of voices and firelight. When the dance slowed and the drums softened, Running Bear approached. He crouched so that his eyes met Clementine's. His gaze was intense, but not unkind. He placed a large hand on her shoulder. "You brave," he said, his English slow but steady. "Many hearts fear river. You are no fear. You save my blood, my daughter, my family. So," he paused, as if searching for the right words, "you are family, my heart." Clementine's throat tightened. Her grandmother had always told her that family wasn't just blood. It was who stood beside you when the world grew dark. But hearing it now, from a man she had met only this morning, felt like a promise that would never break. He reached into the leather pouch at his side and pulled out something small. It was a feather, perfectly white, tied with a thin strip of red cloth. He handed it to her. "This," he said, "spirit feather, courage. You keep." Clementine held the feather carefully, as if it were made of glass. The firelight caught its edges, making it glow faintly. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Later that night, Clementine lay beside Ayana in a small teepee. The warmth from the fire outside seeped through the hide walls, and the scent of wood smoke clung to the air. Ayana had fallen asleep quickly, her breathing soft and steady. Clementine stared up at the ceiling, watching the shadows shift with the flickering flames outside. Her thoughts drifted to her grandmother. Would she be proud of me? Clementine imagined her grandmother's voice. "Child, the heart always knows where home is." She turned the medallion Running Bear had given her over and over in her hands. It felt heavy with meaning, like a bridge between the life she had lost and the one she had just begun. By morning, the camp had embraced her. Women showed her how to braid her hair with beads and feathers. Children giggled as they tried to teach her words from their language. She didn't understand everything, but laughter translated easily enough. Running Bear's warriors were more reserved, but Clementine caught them watching her with quiet respect. Once, she saw the oldest warrior. His hair streaked with gray, nod slightly at her as if to say, "You are one of us now." That afternoon, one of the women handed Clementine a dress made of soft buckskin. It was light brown, decorated with simple patterns stitched by hand. She slipped it on, and for the first time in months, she felt new. Not like the ragged girl who had gathered firewood alone, but like someone who belonged to something greater. Ayana clapped her hands when she saw the dress. "Sister," she said proudly. "Beautiful." Ayana led Clementine back to the river where they had first met. The sun shimmered on the water, turning it into a sheet of gold. For a long moment they just stood there watching the current flow. "River strong," Ayana said, tapping her chest. "But heart stronger." Clementine smiled. The river no longer looked as menacing as it had that night. It looked alive, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything, and how much she had gained. That evening, the tribe gathered again for a smaller fire. Running Bear told stories. Stories of great hunts, of winters survived, of the wisdom of ancestors. When he spoke of Clementine's rescue, everyone looked at her with warmth, their faces lit by the firelight. Clementine realized something then. Family wasn't the walls you lived inside, or the blood that ran through your veins. Family was the hands that reached for you when you were drowning, the voices that sang with you under the stars, the people who saw you for who you were and still called you theirs.